He put a used truck up for sale online. That is where this story begins. Not in a dark alley or a stranger's basement, but in a driveway in Ancaster, Ontario, on a cool May evening in 2013, with a young father doing something utterly ordinary, meeting two men who said they wanted to buy his pickup. Tim Bosma was 32. He had a wife, a toddler, a home that looked like any other on the street. That night, when the doorbell rang, his wife watched as two men stood outside. One of them, she'd later recall, had a word tattooed along his wrist. They chatted. It felt like any other private sale. Tim grabbed his keys. He told his wife he'd be back soon. Then he left in the truck with the two men. He was never seen alive again. When he did not return, the first feeling in the house was irritation, not dread. Sales can run long. People negotiate. Maybe they were haggling over price or taking the truck on the highway, but minutes stretched into hours. Calls went unanswered. The ordinary script of the evening broke, and a new one began. One that started with worry, moved to the police, and spread outward into one of the largest searches in Ontario's recent history. The next day, Tim Bosma's face was everywhere. Flyers, press conferences, social media. Hamilton police held briefings, asking anyone who had seen his black Dodge Ram or the two men from the test drive to come forward. This was not a case where a missing person quietly slipped off the radar. The search was loud from the start. One of the people watching that coverage was a man named Igor Tumenenko. A few nights earlier, he had taken two prospective buyers on a test drive in his own truck. He remembered them clearly, not because of anything dramatic, but because one had a distinctive tattoo and insisted on driving fast. When he saw the police describing the suspects, something clicked. He called it in. That call gave investigators something they desperately needed: a pattern. Two different truck owners, in two different places, approached by men who looked and behaved the same way. In the Tumenenko test drive, nothing had happened, except that the men now had a feel for the truck, the route, and the routine. When police traced phone numbers and checked records, one name began to surface: Dellen Millard, a wealthy aviation heir from the Toronto area. On paper, Millard did not look like the archetype of a desperate car thief. He came from money. His family had run an aviation business, but records and later court proceedings painted a messier picture: debts, a fascination with stealing high-end vehicles, and a life that looked stable from the outside while fraying underneath. Investigators followed that thread, and soon another name joined his: Mark Smich, an associate from Oakville, often seen in Millard's circle. 10 days after Tim disappeared, police moved. They arrested Millard and seized his property, including a large rural farm near Waterloo. There, hidden away from the road, they found a massive industrial incinerator, a piece of equipment ominously nicknamed the Eliminator. Inside and around it, forensic teams would later testify to finding evidence that indicated a body had been burned. In time, investigators concluded that Tim Bosma had been killed and his remains destroyed there. Another critical piece was the truck itself. Police eventually discovered Bosma's pickup hidden in a trailer at Millard's mother's home. It had been partially stripped, seats removed, VIN altered, interior wiped, but not well enough. Forensic officers testified that they found Tim's blood and a fingerprint matching Millard on the rearview mirror, as if it had been adjusted by a new driver. At this point, the investigation shifted from a desperate missing person search to a homicide file with two men at the center. But one thing remained stubbornly unclear: why? This was not a ransom plot. There were no demands, no calls. Prosecutors would later argue that the motive was a blend of thrill and theft, that Tim's truck was targeted and his life was treated as an obstacle to be removed. Defense lawyers, unsurprisingly, told different stories. The only people who truly know what was said inside that cab are the three men who left the driveway that night, and only two came back. When the trial began in Hamilton in 2016, the courtroom became a slow, careful reconstruction of a night the victim never got to explain. Witnesses described the test drive. Forensic experts walked the jury through bloodstains, fingerprints, and cell tower pings. Phone records placed Millard's device near Bosma's home at the right time, lining up with what Tim's widow remembered: 2 strangers at the door just after 9, and a husband who said he'd be right back. The Crown's theory, based on the evidence, was blunt. Tim Bosma was shot at close range inside his own truck not long after leaving home. His body moved and later burned in the incinerator on Millard's property. They presented this not as a crime of panic, but as something that had been prepared for, the equipment ready, the disposal site already chosen. The defense tried to create distance, each man pointing away from himself, but the physical evidence kept circling them both. Outside the legal details, there was a human cost that could not be quantified. In victim impact statements, Tim's wife and family described a life carved in half, a child who would grow up without a father. Milestones missed forever, an ordinary evening that had become an anniversary of loss. Those statements were not evidence of guilt. The verdict had already been reached. They were evidence of damage, of what it means when a routine interaction with strangers ends with a permanent absence at the dinner table. Dellen Millard and Mark Smich were both convicted of first-degree murder in Tim Bosma's death and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. For Millard, it did not end there. He would later be convicted in 2 additional murders: the disappearance of Laura Babcock and the death of his father. Wayne Smich would also be convicted in the Babcock case. What began for police as one man missing after a test drive turned out to be a doorway into a much darker pattern. Even with those convictions, questions linger. Why target Tim specifically on that particular night? How many trial details reflect careful planning, and how many reveal impulsive escalation? Were there earlier moments where someone could have seen enough to intervene? Earlier thefts? Earlier attempts? Earlier red flags? These are the kinds of questions that keep a case alive in public memory long after the courtroom doors close. This is where true crime easily tips into myth. It is tempting to frame killers as monsters with supernatural foresight, to see their actions as part of a grand design. But here, as in many cases, what we see instead is something uglier and more mundane: arrogance, entitlement, the belief that other people's lives can be treated as disposable. The horror is not that the plan was brilliant. The horror is that it was simple enough to work until it didn't. Tim Bosma's story sits in a strange space between solved and haunting. Legally, there is closure, convictions, sentences, a narrative accepted by a jury. But emotionally, for a community that watched a neighbor vanish after doing something as ordinary as selling a truck, the discomfort remains. Because if this can happen on a quiet Canadian street at 9 p.m., it can happen anywhere a stranger rings a bell and asks for a ride. So if you ever find yourself meeting a buyer off an online ad, remember this story, not as a reason to live in fear, but as a reason to take small precautions seriously. Meet in public spaces when you can. Bring someone with you. Trust the unease that makes you say, "Not tonight." The line between a routine errand and a tragedy is often thinner than it looks. And when you hear headlines about the Bosma case, try not to let the label flatten the person. He was not just a victim of a notorious crime. He was a husband, a father, a man who did something a lot of us have done: opened his door to strangers because life seemed safe enough to allow it. The least we can do when we retell his story is remember the name that matters most.